Hey class, the following is a recording of the list story lecture that I'm going to give with an emphasis on science fiction and fantasy. Um, so I want to begin by just talking about what we're going to be going through in this class for today. So just have a little bit of updates for the class, a writing exercise that we're going to have. The lecture, I'm going to be talking about Sherman Alexie's Indian Education, and then exercise 9. Exercise 9 is going to be published on a discussion board, which is already up. Essentially, exercise 9 is just a rough draft of your final fiction short story, which is going to be 1.5 pages. And then also, if you haven't made an appointment with me, I think we're still missing 2 or 3 students that still haven't had a chance to make an appointment with me. Please do so. You can email me or text me. My phone number is 562-212-2131. Um, and so we could schedule an appointment and just talk a little bit about where we're at in the class and how we're feeling. It'll be extremely brief, so you don't have to worry too much about that. So I've had conferences with some of you, and the whole people that I've had conferences with, everyone's doing extremely well. But please call or email me to ask about specific due dates. I know that things could get a little bit confusing. Um, and then also, everything's posted on the course schedule, and I try my best to keep it updated. So if you have any questions, like you're not entirely sure, be sure to refer back to the course schedule first before asking questions and stuff. Although, if you have questions, feel free to ask. I'm totally open to that, which is completely great. So for the writing prompt for today that I want you guys to turn in, I want you to write a short scene that concerns the following situation. And this has to do with really the pandemic. So in this situation, you're a university librarian trying to protect the books in your care in order to preserve knowledge for future generations. So it basically, this pandemic plunges people into a new dark age marked by hysteria, superstition, and anti-intellectualism. Some of it which we're seeing now, right? It's funny because this was a writing prompt that I actually wanted to do before this whole COVID situation happened, so it kind of fits in together a little bit. Um, as a little refresher, we're going to be talking of list stories. We're going to be talking about Sherman Alexie's Indian Education. So, how does he utilize it? The list story in Indian Education, right? The list type story. So, as I talked about previously in Carmen Maria Machado's Inventory, how it starts off with a mantra or a saying. This does something a little bit different. So the list story is connected by each grade. So it starts off in the first grade and ends in the 12th grade, right? So there's an expectation that's being met. There's a straight narrative, and that beginning, right, that listing of first, second, third grade is a through line that readers are experiencing, and it's kind of like paving the way for a specific narrative. The interesting about this story that it showcases the enormous challenge that the Native children, Native American children, or American Indian children have to face getting education on reservations, and he's sort of commenting, critiquing this past idea of the boarding school reservation education. So they used to send Native American or American indigenous peoples to these boarding schools. And their slogan, their saying for these schools is "Kill the Indian, save the child," right? Which is incredibly, awful and horrible. But you guys should read some of that stuff in that history. It's a particularly brutal history, but I think it's incredibly important. Um, and sort of the stories and narratives that come out of that are really interesting and really sad to read. Um, but what's interesting is how the list story focuses and uses this list story. So school becomes sort of this institutionalized racism. It's shown to be this thing that keeps perpetuating this racism, right? And the list story gives us an idea of that, right? But racism is also a form of education. He's sort of realizing um, the narrator through this like education that like being brown comes with these problems. He's learning how to sort of navigate the space of a white world while being brown. And then the list story in this particular short story is really playing with historical and vertical time. So again, he's bringing up this idea of kill the Indian, save the child. He doesn't talk about that specifically, right? He's not talking about the boarding schools or that history. But it's sort of in a way is implying that, right? And also that vertical time, right? So each vignette, it seems like this story is written by like a 12th grader, right? It's very simple. It's very sort of low key. It isn't grammatically complex. There isn't like a lot of crazy words that are being thrown out. So it feels real in that way, right? It looks like a 12th grader looking back on this sort of history of institutionalized racism. So really interesting use of historical and vertical time, which is something that you should take note of when you're writing your list story. But it's not to say, there's a lot of great qualities of this story. Not to say that Sherman Alexie isn't a problematic writer. He is a problematic writer, and I want to draw attention and focus on that. If we had more time together, we would talk about sort of those problems with his writing. Unfortunately, we won't be able to. As you're all aware, he has a lot of sexual misconduct accusations against him. Um, it's unfortunate because he was an important figure for American literary life and arts, but he should have. It's a terrible thing that he did, and he is an extremely problematic writer. But I think this story, it was worth it for me to show you just because I've never quite seen discussions on American indigenous life and racism. So again, I apologize for including such a problematic writer and having you guys read his work. And if you haven't read his work, please at least take a look at Indian Education. Yeah. So moving on from just the list story, I just want to talk about science fiction and fantasy because it's something that you guys have shown interest in. This is a little chart that I brought. This is kind of going to lead into sort of the problems that I have with science fiction and fantasy. So these are some like basic archetypes that science fiction and fantasy have. So they have the hero, the ancient mystagogue, the enemy, the threshold guardian, the shapeshifter, the trickster. Really, these are kind of funny little formulas that you could put in. I wouldn't really suggest utilizing one of these, and I know that a lot of science fiction and fantasy sort of writing and workshops and classes, they're a big advocate and proponent for this type of style of writing, which isn't necessarily great, and it's not very intuitive. Because I'll tell you what, a lot of this type of formulaic writing, such as Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, it's sort of based on an ignorance of people's cultures and beliefs, and what you kind of stereotype them into specific generic groups. And this is sort of doing that same thing, right? A lot of these different stories, like they borrow from a lot of different cultures, especially Star Wars. And I think that, and George Lucas, I think he did utilize Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey to some extent, but I mean that's why a little bit of the writing's kind of bland in Star Wars. From a perspective of someone that does nothing to do with movies, right? But it's sort of formulaic, right? And that's what I want you guys to try to avoid from writing really generic um, science fiction or fantasy because there's a lot of cool and interesting things you could do. There's a lot of techniques that I feel that are left out, and we're going to try to utilize here. But yeah, so it's kind of a huge flaw in an anthropological point of view if you're using Hero's Journey because you're basically regurgitating and recycling mythologies like from other cultures into your story and not really understanding them. In the Hero's Journey, it's sort of extremely generic. You can't compare like a Shinto folktale to a Greek story, right? The narrative structures are completely different because you're analyzing them from a different cultural and anthropological point of view. And if you do something like that, that is examining things really generically, it creates like extremely bland literature. So it's something that we want to try to avoid. Um, and then the important thing with science fiction and fantasy now is that you're trying to connect your plot with a problem that is contemporary, right? So think of Black Mirror for science fiction, right? Everything is relating back to some sort of like altered or dystopian type of society, but it's very like um, thematically unified with what we're like what I think can like what we're struggling with today as a society. So I think for big rule of thumb, especially if you're looking at Philip K. Dick, right? He's another science fiction writer that's he's probably the father of science fiction. Well, not the father. but he's an extremely important part of science fiction. But um, you have to understand how like democracy and capitalism fits in your science fiction and your fantasy writing, because if you could critique it in some way and make an interesting sort of point of view on just these two thematic structures in your science fiction story, then you're going to be doing something incredible. Um, and it's something that you should try to hone in some way. Think about sort of these like altered states of reality, right? I mean, Game of Thrones, even at the end of the TV show, although no one liked the season 8, right? Um, Democracy was something that was like discussed, right? It was like the invention of democracy happened. So I think you're going to touch base with either of these in science fiction and fantasy. You're going to talk about them no matter what. So you have to remember to do something interesting with them. Um, do not have long battle scenes. Please, dear God, do not have long battle scenes. This is the most important thing. When I was in workshops in my undergraduate, like there's people that did write science fiction and fantasy, and it was just like gratuitous, like violence, and it went on for pages and pages and pages. Don't do that. Um, this only type of writing only works well in Beowulf, because people deemed it old and they're like, this is important because it's old. So don't do that now. If you read contemporary science fiction or fantasy that's like popular now and it gets a lot of attention, it's because those battle scenes are very short and sweet, right? So I want you guys to focus on character development and dialogue, and then imply a larger world, right? And this will help. This implied world is going to help visualize and paint a larger picture for your reader. So please remember that. If you have nothing else to remember in this lesson, remember these key points, okay? No long battle scenes, short and sweet, character development, dialogue, implied world, okay? Um, no second writing exercise. Continue your writing towards exercise 9, and don't worry about creating something for today. Just keep writing your rough draft. That'll be it for a lesson. Please be sure to schedule a conference with me. Thank you guys, and I hope you're hanging in there.